In October of 1964, a sanctioning body did something almost unheard of in the history of motorsport. NASCAR looked at an engine that hadn't run a single competitive lap, hadn't turned a single official time, hadn't even lined up for one race, and banned it anyway. Not because it cheated, not because it broke a rule already on the books. They banned it because the numbers coming off the dyno were frightening enough that officials didn't want to find out what would happen if it actually raced against a full field on a high-banked oval at 180 miles an hour. Most engines earn a ban the hard way, by winning too much, by getting caught, by pushing the sport past what it can defend to the public. This one skipped all of that. It was banned in theory before it existed in practice. Judged guilty on paperwork and dyno sheets alone, and when the door slammed shut on one side of American racing, the engine didn't disappear into some forgotten parts bin. It walked straight through another door, into a sport that was more than happy to let it loose, and once it did, two of drag racing's most fearless drivers turned it into one of the most dominant, most feared engines of the entire decade. Think about how rare that is. Racing history is full of engines and cars that got banned after the fact, after they'd already won a championship, already embarrassed a field of competitors, already forced officials into an uncomfortable position in front of the cameras. This one never got the chance to embarrass anybody on the track it was built for. It was judged and executed on paper, in a boardroom, before a single green flag ever dropped on it. And that's exactly what makes the second half of its story so unlikely. This is the story of the Ford 427 SOHC, the engine everyone just called the Cammer, banned by one sanctioning body before it ever raced, set loose by another, where it went on to terrify competitors, rewrite speed records, and drag two of the biggest manufacturers in America into a fight neither one of them could fully win. Stick with us through 5 chapters, because by the end, you'll understand why an engine that never raced a single NASCAR event still managed to change the entire direction of 1960s drag racing. Number one thing you need to understand about the Cammer: it was never supposed to be a drag racing engine. It was built as a weapon in a completely different war, one being fought on the high banks of Daytona and Charlotte, not the quarter mile. By 1964, Chrysler had unleashed the 426 Hemi onto NASCAR's biggest ovals, and it was dominating in a way that genuinely alarmed the competition. The Hemi's hemispherical combustion chambers allowed for larger valves and better airflow than almost anything else racing at the time. And Chrysler's factory teams were suddenly lapping the field in a way that made every other manufacturer's engineering department nervous. The 1964 Daytona 500 in particular became something of a public embarrassment for Ford, watching Chrysler's Hemi-powered cars sweep the top finishing positions on the biggest stage in the sport, in front of the largest audience stock car racing had that year. Ford, sitting on its conventional 427 high-riser pushrod engine, a motor that had given them real competitiveness just a season earlier, needed an answer, and needed it fast before Chrysler's advantage calcified into something the rest of the field simply couldn't claw back from. Ford's engineers didn't tinker at the margins. They went straight for a single overhead cam design, a genuinely radical departure from anything Ford had raced before, built specifically to outbreathe and outrun the Hemi on the same tracks where Chrysler had just started running the table. It was an aggressive, almost desperate swing, the kind of engineering decision a company makes when it feels like it's already a season behind and can't afford to be conservative. There was no time for a slow, methodical development cycle. Ford essentially told its engineers to build the most advanced racing V8 they were capable of, cost and complexity be damned, and figure out the rest later. What they came up with was a 427 cubic inch V8, with a single overhead camshaft per bank, chain-driven off the crankshaft, through a design that was mechanically far more complex and far more expensive to produce than anything else in Ford's lineup at the time. The valve train could rev harder and flow more air than a conventional pushrod design ever could. On gasoline in race trim, the Cammer was reportedly good for north of 600 horsepower. numbers that would have made it one of the most powerful production-based V8s ever built for competition at that point in American racing history, arguably the single most advanced piece of engineering Ford had ever committed to a stock car adjacent program. Engineers who worked on the project later described it less as an evolution of Ford's existing V8 architecture and more as an entirely new engine that happened to share a displacement figure with its predecessor. The chain-driven cam alone required a completely different front engine cover, a longer block, and a redesigned oiling system just to keep everything alive at race speeds. Ford wasn't being subtle about what this engine was for. It was built to go toe-to-toe with the Hemi on the biggest stages in NASCAR, and everyone in the garage area knew it. Word travels fast in racing, and by the time Ford was ready to campaign the Cammer, rival teams already understood exactly what kind of threat was about to show up on the grid. Which is exactly why, on October 19, 1964, NASCAR's leadership made a decision that still gets talked about in racing history circles more than 60 years later. They announced a ban on what they called special racing engines, a rule written broadly enough to catch both the Cammer and the Hemi in the same net, eliminating both from Grand National competition heading into the 1965 season. It's worth pausing on how unusual this ruling actually was. NASCAR wasn't banning a part that had failed a technical inspection. They weren't responding to a safety incident. They were making a preemptive judgment call based almost entirely on projected performance. That letting these engines compete would fundamentally break the parity the series depended on to stay competitive and entertaining for fans. Chrysler's response was to temporarily pull out of NASCAR entirely in protest, a genuine standoff between one of America's biggest automakers and its biggest stock car sanctioning body, the kind of manufacturer walkout that could have permanently reshaped the sport if it had dragged on much longer. Chrysler sat out a significant portion of the 1965 season rather than race without the Hemi, a decision that cost NASCAR real ticket sales and manufacturer credibility at a moment when the sport could least afford it. Ford, characteristically, chose a quieter path. They kept racing NASCAR with their conventional pushrod 427, swallowing the setback rather than making a public spectacle of it, and they took the Cammer somewhere else entirely. Here's what makes this story different from almost every other banned engine story in motorsport history. Ford didn't just shelve the Cammer and move on. They had already sunk serious engineering hours and real money into a race-ready V8, tooling, prototypes, and a development program that had been running for the better part of a year. And they weren't about to let it rot in a warehouse because one sanctioning body said no. For a while, Ford genuinely held out hope that public pressure might force NASCAR to reverse course. They reportedly displayed a Cammer-powered 1964 Galaxy in front of the crowds at the 1964 Indianapolis 500, hoping the positive attention and press coverage might soften NASCAR's position and generate enough fan and media pressure to force a reconsideration. It never worked. NASCAR's ban held firm through the following season and beyond, and Ford eventually accepted that the Cammer's future wasn't going to be found on an oval, no matter how much good press they generated for it elsewhere. So Ford turned to NHRA's factory experimental class, a class that, unlike NASCAR, was practically built to welcome exactly this kind of radical, borderline experimental engineering without asking too many questions. It was, in a lot of ways, the perfect landing spot. Factory experimental existed specifically as a space for manufacturers to push the absolute limits of what a production-based car could become, and an engine this advanced, this overbuilt, fit that mission almost too perfectly. Where NASCAR had looked at the Cammer and seen a threat to competitive balance, NHRA's factory experimental teams looked at the same engine and saw an opportunity. By 1965, factory-backed Mustangs and Mercury Comets running Cammer power were entering the AFX class, and almost immediately they weren't just competitive. They were dominant. These weren't stock cars with a hot engine dropped in. They were purpose-built factory racers wearing production badges, fiberglass body panels replacing steel to save weight, altered wheelbases, shifting the balance for better weight transfer off the line, and a Cammer engine in full race tune sitting under the hood, doing exactly what NASCAR had been afraid it would do on an oval, except now it was doing it on a quarter-mile drag strip instead. In a strange way, NASCAR's ban had handed NHRA one of the most competitively lopsided engines of the entire decade, completely free of charge, fully developed and race-ready, with none of the development cost NHRA teams would otherwise have had to absorb themselves. And once the Cammer landed in the hands of the right drivers, this wasn't just a story about an engine anymore. It became a story about exactly how fast and exactly how far two of drag racing's most fearless names were willing to push it, and how quickly those numbers started rewriting what anyone thought a factory experimental car was capable of. Don Nicholson, known throughout the sport as Dyno Don for his early mastery of the chassis dynamometer, a skill he'd developed years earlier working as a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership before he'd ever driven competitively, was one of the first drivers to fully commit to the Cammer, campaigning a Cammer-powered Mercury Comet throughout the entire 1965 season. His numbers were the kind that made rival crews start asking uncomfortable questions about their own engine programs. Nicholson was consistently running quarter-mile times in the mid-10-second range, at trap speeds approaching 135 miles an hour, in a car that still looked from a distance like something you might see on a used car lot. Over the course of the season, Nicholson experimented relentlessly with the Cammer's induction setup, trying Weber carburetors and Hilborn fuel injection before eventually settling on a dual 4-barrel Hawley configuration. This wasn't a driver simply strapping in and mashing the throttle. Nicholson was essentially running a rolling engineering program every single race weekend, chasing every last fraction of a second the Cammer had to give, tuning and retuning between rounds in whatever garage space a track happened to offer, and by most accounts of the era, the engine on gasoline alone was good for something in the neighborhood of 600 horsepower. A genuinely staggering figure for a production-based Vate in 1965, a number that wouldn't feel out of place in a much later era of drag racing. Nicholson's willingness to treat every single carburetor swap and cam timing adjustment as its own small experiment is part of why his name became so tightly linked to the Cammer's reputation. He wasn't just driving the engine in a lot of ways. He was still developing it, race weekend by race weekend, long after it had officially left Ford's engineering department. Then there was Connie Kalitta, who took the Cammer somewhere Nicholson didn't, into pure speed record territory, running a Cammer-powered car at an NHRA national event that year. Kalitta reportedly became the first driver in that association's history to break the 200-mile-an-hour barrier. 200 miles an hour in the quarter mile in 1965, on an engine that a rival sanctioning body had banned less than a year earlier for being too dangerous to even let race on an oval where the whole car, not just the engine, was under scrutiny. Sit with that for a second. The same engine NASCAR had deemed too much of a threat to allow anywhere near a stock car oval was now the engine putting up numbers nobody in drag racing had ever officially recorded before. It wasn't hypothetically dangerous anymore. It was demonstrably, provably faster than anything else on the strip, and it had two of the sport's most respected names behind the wheel proving it race after race, weekend after weekend, in front of crowds that had absolutely no idea they were watching an engine that, on paper, wasn't even supposed to exist in competitive form. Gas Ronda added another chapter to the legend, taking a Cammer-powered Mustang to the 1965 NHRA Winter Nationals title in the AFX class, running a 10.82-second pass at 128 miles an hour, in a car that weighed barely over 3,000 pounds. And Ronda wasn't alone in flying the Cammer's colors. Drivers like Jack Chrisman and Fast Eddie Schartman also campaigned Cammer power through this stretch, each one adding their own results to a growing pile of evidence that this engine simply didn't have a weakness anyone had found yet. Between Nicholson, Kalitta, Ronda, and the rest of the Cammer contingent, the engine wasn't just competing in factory experimental racing by mid-1965, it was rewriting what that class was even supposed to look like, one race weekend at a time, and putting every rival manufacturer's engineering department on notice that the engine NASCAR had tried to bury was very much alive somewhere else. Here's where the story loops back on itself in a way that almost feels too neat to be true except it's exactly what happened. An engine that had been banned for being too dominant in one sport went on to become so dominant in a completely different sport that its own competitors started lobbying to have it restricted there too, as Cammer-powered cars kept piling up wins through the mid to late 1960s. Rival manufacturers, the same Chrysler and General Motors camps, whose own factory teams were now regularly getting beaten by Ford's supposedly banned engine, began pushing hard for NHRA to reconsider allowing it in competition. It wasn't a quiet grumbling in the pits, confined to a few disgruntled crew chiefs muttering after a loss. Teams were watching an engine born from a NASCAR ban start to threaten the competitive balance of an entirely different series, the same way it had once threatened NASCAR's own balance, and by 1970, mounting pressure from rival camps contributed to NHRA moving to outlaw the Cammer from competition as well. There's a genuine irony worth sitting with here. The same manufacturers who had years earlier benefited from NASCAR's decision to ban the Cammer before it could challenge their own cars, now found themselves on the receiving end of that exact same engine in a completely different racing series. With no NASCAR-style preemptive ban to protect them this time, they'd gotten a free pass once. This time, they had to fight for it, lobbying and campaigning to get a rule changed after the engine had already proven race after race exactly what it was capable of. Think about the full arc of that story. Banned by NASCAR in 1964 before it ever raced a single lap. Set loose in NHRA drag racing, where it went on to break speed records and dominate an entire class through the back half of the decade. And then, eventually pushed out of that sport too. Not because officials were scared of a hypothetical anymore, but because its rivals had run out of other ways to beat it on the strip and had to go over the engine's head to a rule book instead. Two different sanctioning bodies, two different decades of the same story, one engine that simply refused to lose gracefully in either one. By the time it was finished racing at the top level, the Cammer had done something remarkably few engines in American motorsport history can claim. It had been powerful enough to get banned twice, once before it ever competed, purely on projected performance, and once after it had already proven, beyond any argument, exactly how dangerous it actually was to the competitive order of an entire class. Most engines are remembered for one great era. The Cammer is remembered for forcing two separate sanctioning bodies in two separate decades to each independently reach the exact same conclusion about it, and the story doesn't end with the ban. It ends with what the Cammer left behind, in the cars it powered, in the drivers who campaigned it, and in the way it quietly reshaped how manufacturers thought about the line between a race engine and a street engine for years afterward, because the Cammer was never mass-produced for public sale in any meaningful volume. Ford built it strictly as a competition piece with no real plan to put it in a showroom car. It developed a strange, almost mythical reputation in the years after its racing career wound down. Parts were scarce almost from day one. Rebuilding one meant tracking down components that Ford had never intended to sell in bulk in the first place, often through personal connections to old factory crews or salvaged parts from cars that had long since been retired. By the 1970s and beyond, a genuine Cammer engine had become one of the most sought-after, hand-me-down pieces of hardware in the entire vintage drag racing world, a direct physical link to a 2-year window in the mid-1960s when it was arguably the most feared engine in American racing. Full stop. Collectors and restorers who've chased down surviving Cammer blocks in the decades since have described a kind of quiet reverence around the engine that few other pieces of 1960s racing hardware command. Finding a numbers matching Cammer today, correctly documented back to a factory-backed 1965 program, is treated less like finding a spare part and more like finding a genuine piece of motorsport history, something closer to an artifact than an engine. Drivers who campaigned it, Nicholson, Kalita, Ronda, and others who ran Cammer power through the factory experimental era, including names like Jack Chrisman and Fast Eddie Sharkman, carried the association with them for the rest of their careers. Being known as a Cammer driver in this era wasn't a footnote in a resume. It meant you'd strapped yourself into one of the most powerful, least forgiving, most controversial engines of the decade and made it work when plenty of other teams couldn't get the reliability or the tuning right at all. It took a specific kind of mechanical patience and nerve to keep a Cammer alive through an entire season of national events, and the small handful of teams who managed it became a sort of unofficial club within the sport, trading knowledge and parts in ways that outsiders were rarely let into. And there's something worth sitting with in just how differently the two sanctioning bodies handled the exact same engine. NASCAR looked at the Cammer on paper, decided the threat alone was too great, and shut the door before it ever opened, prioritizing the appearance of competitive fairness over ever finding out what would actually happen on the track. NHRA looked at the same engine and made the opposite bet, that letting it race, letting it prove itself against everything else on the strip, was better for the sport and better for the fans in the stands than banning it out of fear of what it might do. For nearly 6 years, that bet paid off in some of the most memorable performances of the era, filling grandstands with fans who wanted to see exactly how far this engine could actually be pushed. And when NHRA eventually did move against it too, it wasn't out of fear of a hypothetical. It was because the engine had already done everything everyone worried it would, and then some. There's a lesson buried in the Cammer's story that goes beyond horsepower numbers and quarter-mile times. Every sanctioning body in motorsport has to make the same impossible calculation over and over again. Do you ban the thing that scares you before it ever proves what it can do, or do you let it race and deal with the consequences after, whenever they finally arrive? NASCAR chose the first path in 1964, and in doing so, they handed one of the most dangerous engines of the decade directly to a rival sport where it went on to terrify officials there too, just on a different kind of track. NHRA chose the second path and spent the better part of 6 years watching an engine nobody else wanted to touch rewrite what was possible in factory experimental racing, before finally reaching the same conclusion NASCAR had reached years earlier, just later, and only after the engine had already left its mark permanently on the sport's record books. Either way, the outcome was the same: an engine that good was never going to stay contained for long. Ban it before it races and it finds a home somewhere else, on somebody else's track, in somebody else's hands. Let it race, and it eventually forces your hand anyway, once the winds pile up too high to ignore. The Cammer didn't just prove that a great engine will always find a way onto the track. It proved that no single sanctioning body, no matter how early they move or how hard they try, ever really gets the final word on an engine this fast. Somewhere, in a climate-controlled garage that most fans will never see, an original Cammer block still sits on an engine stand, a quiet, hand-built reminder that the fastest way to guarantee something becomes legendary is to try banning it before it's even had the chance to prove you right.